So we're in the 9 days now, right? Between Rosh Chodesh Av and Tisha B'Av. Between the 1st of Av and the 9th of Av is a period of 9 days, a period of somewhat intense national mourning, where we focus on another. The truth is, there are a few things that we mourn on the 9th of Av, but the main story is really I don't know if it's the main story, but certainly where our focus is generally the destruction of the two temples and the story that links the 17th of Tammuz, which begins the 3-week mourning period that intensifies on Rosh Chodesh, to the 9th of Av. Both 17th of Tammuz and 9th of Av commemorate multiple events that are tragic events in our history, but what links them is the Great Revolt against the Romans and the destruction of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. Right? So I want to focus a little bit today on that story, or on its meaning, and who some of the characters were. What is the story of the Great Revolt? It's very interesting that this has essentially been faded into the background of our history, of the story we tell ourselves, of the story we teach our children. Right? Most children attending Jewish schools in the diaspora don't really learn this story. I mean, maybe part of the reason is that this period of the year is during summer vacation. That, might be a reason why it's not learned, but I suspect it's more than that. A lot of people in yeshivot, a lot of people who spent years and years and years in the Beit Midrash don't really know this story, don't really know what happened, why it's important, why it's still relevant for us, who were the Zealots, what was the Zealot movement, what was it fighting for, what was it fighting against, does it exist today, right? Where did it grow out of? Right now, according to Josephus, and Josephus is the best, but also the most problematic source we have for all this information, because Josephus was a character in the story, and he's a very biased character. He ends up siding with the Romans, and he ends up writing this history in such a way that is flattering to the Romans and vilifies the Jewish freedom fighters. Now, Josephus had allies in trying to...
Was he Jewish?
Josephus was a Kohen. He was a Kohen who actually considered himself to be a Navi, and came to the conclusion that the Creator was on the side of the Romans in this war, that what Israel needs to do is surrender to Rome. He probably fancied himself like a Yirmiyahu. Remember, Yirmiyahu, also a Kohen, also a Navi, he was a Navi.
He was a Navi.
He prophesied that Israel should surrender, Judea specifically, the kingdom of Judea should surrender to the Babylonians. Right? That was Yirmiyahu's message to Israel, one of his messages, that we can't win this, that Hashem has decided that Jerusalem will come under Babylonian rule, we should surrender. That was his prophecy. Now, when a prophet tells us to violate the Torah, once we do it, but if the prophet tells us to negate that part of the Torah, we don't do it. Right? Meaning, if a prophet says, this Yom Chamishi, everybody has to eat the leg of a pig, okay, we know it's a proven prophet, and this time, Yom Chamishi, we're going to eat the leg of a pig. But if the prophet says, from now on we could eat pig, we don't accept that.
It's not just we don't accept it, we kill him.
So it's not taken as like the prophet doesn't have the right to change the Torah. The prophet can come in special circumstances and say, okay, we have to violate this in this time because it's what Hashem wants here, and that's the message, right? So if we are commanded to liberate our land from foreign rule always, if we have a permanent mitzvah to possess the land of Israel, right? This is not only a commandment given to Am Yisrael, like when we receive the Torah, this is a commandment that was given to Avraham Avinu, right? Like the patriarchs basically had two major mitzvot. They had Brit Milah, and they had possessed the land. Right? Those were basically the two commandments given to the ancestors. We learn that they lived Torah naturally, even before the Torah was given, but what they were obligated to do was Brit Milah and possess the land. Okay? And if Yirmiyahu is telling us, okay, so we're going to give up our possession of the land temporarily, this time we listen to him. The problem is later in history, there were factions of Israel who were taking Yirmiyahu as a source, likely taking Yirmiyahu as a source for why we don't have an obligation to conquer the land of Israel. Right? Even today, this is not something that is universally accepted by the Torah world. I think it's very clear from the sources that we're obligated to possess the land, and we have an obligation to conquer the land if we don't have it, and we're not allowed to give up any of the land. But there are definitely approaches to the Torah that ignore this, negate it. I don't think it comes so much. In my experience, I haven't found that this position that negates the mitzvah to possess the land, is a position based on serious sources, but rather from the fact that this was an irrelevant part of our identity for 2,000 years. We didn't have the ability to possess the land. There were some attempts over the centuries, but they failed. It wasn't a real practical thing. And what became the focus of halachic study was the Dalet Amot, the personal mitzvot, Shabbat, family purity, kashrut, chagim, right? This was really the focus of how we, learned Torah for 2,000 years in exile. So, because we have this whole area of our Torah that's unexplored, now it's a problem because it's not just another detail. Learning the laws relevant to possessing the land isn't just another detail of Torah. Like, okay, there's the laws of Shabbat and the laws of this. It's actually the context. Because we're meant to be not a bunch of humans, just observing a religion all over the world. We're meant to be a nation with possession of a specific land that organizes its society according to specific values and laws and ideals, in order that we manifest the divine ideal in every sphere of human behavior, national existence. Right? We have to have a holy healthcare system. We have to have a holy transportation system. We have to have a holy army. We have to have a holy economy. We have to have a holy sanitation system. Right? We have to have a holy government. These are the things that Israel's commanded to do, to be mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. Right? To be a kingdom of kohanim, like we're meant to be the kohanim to humanity, and a goy kadosh, a holy nation. Right? That's the commandment to be. Before we receive the Torah at Sinai, in Parshat Yitro. That's the context. So when approach to Torah lacks this, it's, from my perspective, it's not just that we have a machloket on a specific area of halacha, and okay, maybe they're right, maybe we're right, okay, elu ve'elu. I think in this specific instance, it's not elu ve'elu. I think in this specific instance, there's a mission that Israel has in history, and to get this wrong compromises on that mission. Compromise, the impacts our ability to actually do what we're here to do. Okay? Now, all the halachot are important, obviously. It's not enough just to possess the land. We have to live lives of Torah. We have to live a national life of Torah. But we can't think it's enough to live individual lives of Torah without the national framework, without possession of our land, without the ability to have a holy economy and a holy army and a holy transportation system, etc. Right? These are things that are crucial to who we are, crucial to our identity, and crucial to our mission here. So, Yirmiyahu says temporarily, no. Josephus basically mimics Yirmiyahu, and has this position that Hashem wants us to surrender to Rome. That's basically Josephus' ultimate message by the end of the war. That's the way he's communicating. That's his propaganda, whatever. But I think he believed it. And certainly the way he writes the Jewish war is in such a way that the Romans are, for the most part, good guys, and the Jews are okay too. The Zealots are the problem. Right? The way Josephus presents this is that the problem is the Zealot movement, and that they're like an errant weed. They're just like a misguided minority that actually drove Israel into war against Rome.
What is the Zealot movement?
The Zealot movement.
What are they?
Okay, so what are they is the question. Okay? First of all, it should be known Josephus has an interest in presenting, a positive interest, an interest that maybe we could sympathize with, in presenting the Zealots not as a mainstream Jewish position, but rather as an irresponsible extremist faction that brought the nation to disaster. That's basically his position. Also, our rabbis speak this way to an extent, or some of our chachamim speak to an extent in the Gemara. They present what they call the biryonim in a negative light. Right? Now, remember, it's very important, two things. Number one, at that time, after the destruction of Jerusalem, when Josephus is writing this history, and when there's certain conversations taking place within the rabbinic world, the Romans are trying to decide. They're not trying to decide. There are different forces pressuring in different directions. But they're basically in a situation where they have to either assume this was just some extremist minority that created the conflict who need to be stamped out, or it's the Jews. Right? Do you have a problem with this terrorist group, or is it the Jews? Is it the whole population? And both Josephus and the rabbis had an interest in protecting the Jewish people from Romans believing it's all the Jews, right? Because there were forces in the Roman Empire who said we have to punish all the Jewish people everywhere in the empire for what happened, because it cost the Romans a lot in blood and treasure. So there are certain people who say we should take revenge on all the Jews in all the places where they live, in their land and outside their land, within the empire. And then Josephus says, no, it was just that group. And the rabbis are saying the same thing. Now also I think the rabbis understood that we're going into Galut. And we kept fighting, we kept revolting against the Romans, and at a certain point, just for us to survive, we have to stop, because they would have totally wiped us out if we continued to fight as ferociously as we did, pretty much, every generation. So they needed to kind of quash that spirit within us. Now the problem is we ended up buying it ourselves. A lot of the Jewish people ended up buying into this idea that the Zealots were wrong and bad, and created, a situation that brought us to disaster, and that their opponents, whether it was rabbis who opposed them, whether it was the elites who opposed them, whether it was Josephus who opposed them, they were probably the correct ones. That's dangerous. So according to Josephus, the Zealot movement is started by Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen and Tzedok HaPerushi, and that they start the Zealot movement around the time of Herod's death. Okay, and Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen is important because his direct descendants will be the leaders of the Sicarii, which is the ideological purist Zealot faction. Meaning within the Zealot movement there are many organizations who are often in conflict with each other. Now, according to Josephus, the only difference between the Zealots and the Pharisees, right? He goes through the different philosophies among the Jewish people in first century Judea, and he says the only difference, the Pharisees are what we know to be the rabbis, like the position of the Chachamim in the Gemara.
Like the Haredi or nowadays. More or less.
Not necessarily. I'd say what we know to be the Torah, what evolved as the Torah position, including all the different Torah positions, right? We can say are the Pharisees. Anyone who accepts the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Shebal Peh as binding and divine is pretty much in the camp of the Pharisees. That's what the Pharisees basically were, as opposed to the Sadducees, the Tzdukim. They accepted the Torah Shebechtav, the written Torah, but not the oral Torah, right? So the Pharisees are those who have the Torah, the real Torah, and according to Josephus, the difference between the Zealots and the Pharisees is that the Zealots hold that it's a mitzvah to liberate our land always, to possess the land always. He says that's the difference between them.
Canist.
They're basically holding by the Ramban. They're basically holding by what the Torah says, that we have an obligation. The whole book of Devarim, which we're entering now, is all about possessing the land, right? It's all about how we organize our society when we're in the land. Right? That we have to be in our land, and we have to have sovereignty over our land, and we have to organize a society that radiates Kedusha from our land, right? That expresses Kedusha, that expresses holiness from our land, right? So the Zealots are saying we have to fight Rome to free our land. To accept Roman rule over our land is idolatry. That's the position of the Zealots, and according to Josephus, that's what separates them from the Pharisees. And Josephus also says that the Zealot approach, what he calls the fourth philosophy, was the most popular approach in all of Judea, especially among the young people. So it's not just some tiny splinter group. Okay, it's the majority of the people of Israel, the majority of the Judeans are, to a certain extent, supportive of the Zealot approach, especially the youth. Now, I don't think Josephus is correct that it started with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. Maybe it was concretized, maybe it was given certain more defining principles, but the Zealot movement is really just the evolution of the Maccabim movement. Because you have to remember, when the Maccabim fought the Seleucid Greeks, the majority of their army was initially comprised of the Hasidim, a group called the Hasidim. Now, the Hasidim were willing to fight for Shabbat. They're willing to fight for our calendar. They're willing to fight for learning Torah. They're willing to fight for Brit Milah. They're willing to fight for the things that the Greeks had outlawed in our culture and our practices, and our folkways. But after a few years of fighting together, shoulder to shoulder with the sons of Mattatyahu and their followers, the Maccabim, the Hashmonaim, it became clear that the Hasidim were fighting to live according to our culture and our values freely, and the Maccabim were fighting for more than that. They're fighting for that, but also for political self-determination. Also that we should be free in our land to govern ourselves. And when there came a contradiction, meaning when Lysias, after the battle of Beit Zachariah, after the siege in Jerusalem during a Shemitah year, which is devastating for us, he offers us peace, but we have to be part of the empire. We can live according to the ways of our ancestors. We can live according to our own calendar. We can have Rosh Chodesh. We can have Shabbat. We can have Brit Milah. We can learn Torah. But we have to be part of the empire. The Hasidim said yes. The Maccabim said no. Right? And so that machloket, later the Hasidim evolve into the Prushim, into the Pharisees. And the Maccabim, the ideological movement of the Maccabim, it evolves into the Zealot movement. Okay? Now the problem is that the Hasmonean family, meaning the family of Mattatyahu, specifically the descendants of his son, his second son Shimon, become the royal family of Judea, the Hasmonean kingdom, which is a problem because they're Kohanim, and Kohanim should not be Melachim. But Josephus claims to be a direct biological descendant of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, of Shimon and Mattatyahu. So you have a situation where because the descendants of the Hashmonaim became part of the Judean ruling class, they didn't necessarily continue in that revolutionary ideology. There were some who did, and they were forced out, and the Romans came in and actually, I don't want to get into the whole story of how we lost the Hasmonean dynasty and replaced it with the Roman puppet Herodian dynasty, but basically the Romans, at that point, a lot of the Hasmoneans who were resisting this transition, who were resisting the Roman presence, had kind of rediscovered, we can say, or maybe they were always loyal, it's a good question, to the Maccabee ideology, the Maccabean tendency towards revolution and towards liberating our land and not accepting foreign rule in our land. But certainly we could say the Zealot movement picked up on pretty much what separated the Maccabim from the Hasidim separates the Zealots from the Pharisees. Okay? Although there's one thing that I'll say became more pronounced in the time of the Zealots, and that was the issue of class. Like the Maccabim, I think in the time of the Maccabim, there was a feeling, and there was sometimes, there were moments when it was weaponized rhetorically that, the wealthy Judeans are kind of with the empire, they're collaborating with the empire, and they have certain privileges, and it's really the poor, the rural poor, the urban poor, who were more likely to revolt and to fight against the Greek occupation of our land. Now, it's true. I mean, it's not 100% true. I'm sure there were wealthy Judeans who were on the side of the Maccabim, and there were, I'm sure, people from the lower classes who collaborated with the empire at certain moments. But with the Zealot movement, the issue of class becomes more central. And it's not just that the rich Jews collaborate with the empire and the poor Jews want to fight the empire, it's also specific critiques of how society is organized and how wealth is distributed and the inequality that existed in Judean society, and of course, those who are most privileged and those who benefit from the way society is organized tend to be those who are closer to the Romans. Remember, the Romans ruled our land. The Romans basically appointed the Kohen Gadol, right? The Romans basically gave privileges. And, you have the Herodians and the upper class Kohanim, and you have certain sectors of Judean society who are more privileged, more elite, and that privilege comes from a certain proximity to the Roman Empire and to its vision for our country, its will for our country. Whereas those who are not doing well, those who are living in poverty, and there were a lot of people living in poverty specifically because a lot of Herod's works programs, which had been employing a lot of people, a lot of laborers, when they came to a close, when they stopped, a lot of laborers found themselves to be unemployed. Also, there was some difficult years in terms of just lack of rain and famine and bad agricultural cycles, and the combination of those things, high unemployment and bad agricultural cycles, really created a situation where a lot of Judean society was impoverished and destitute, and it wasn't like there were all these social programs to help people. So you have a situation where one of the first moves made by the freedom fighters when they start to push back against the Romans militarily is to burn the Hall of Debts, to eliminate debt, because at that point a lot of the poor were deeply indebted to the wealthy. And so we burn the Hall of Debts, there's no record of the debts. It's basically liberating all of the poor of the country from their debts. And that was a definitely, I think it was, well, I don't think it was just like a populist move to get more people on the side of the freedom fighters. I think it was something that they believed in, that they believed this is wrong. The way the society is structured and organized is wrong, and it's not fair, and there are tremendous wealth gaps, and there's tremendous inequality, and I mean, and it was connected to the Roman presence. Meaning they also came, like the Maccabim, they also came from the perspective that we have an obligation to free our land. We have an obligation to possess the land. And therefore, there's this combination among the Zealot movement, there's this combination of the national struggle with the class struggle, which makes it more likely that somebody like Josephus, Yosef ben Mattatyahu, who is from the upper class Kohanim, sees himself, he claims to be a biological descendant of the Hasmonean kingdom, so he believes himself to be royalty, have royal blood, certainly a priestly blood, even considers himself to be a Navi, right? So it's very easy for him to criticize the freedom fighters because he's against what they stand for, not just in terms of their fight against Rome, which he disagrees with, although in the beginning he more or less did serve as a commander for the rebel army. Meaning when the Judeans were successful in freeing Jerusalem, they set up like a military government, and they appointed commanders in different regions, and I think the wrong people were in control of that government. The wrong people were in positions of responsibility to lead the war, but certainly at that time there was this idea, or at least there was pretend. The leadership was pretending to be preparing for an all-out war with Rome. I think the leadership was really planning to use the military victory that had occurred in order to pressure the Romans to adopt gentler policies with us, more pro-Judean policies, right? Meaning they were fighting the oppressive Roman regime. If they were fighting at all, they were fighting the oppressive Roman regime. Whereas the Zealot movement, including the Sicarii, including the group that called itself the Zealots. You have to remember, there's a group called the Zealots within the Zealot movement that was mostly Kohanim from the lower class Kohanim in what's today Ir David, pretty much, what we call the lower city of Jerusalem. Okay, as opposed to those who lived in what's now the Jewish quarter of the old city today, who were the upper class Kohanim, and were largely somewhat connected to the Roman regime and complicit in Roman rule, right? They owed their privilege and their positions to the Romans, whereas the lower class Kohanim were not benefiting from the system, were not benefiting from Roman rule, were not benefiting from the way that the economy or even the priesthood was structured at that time, and therefore they were often in joining the Zealot organization, the Kanaim, led by Elazar ben Shimon. Now, they're fighting against Roman rule, and this national struggle also has a class component to it, like a flavor of class struggle as well. The Sicarii were, even though they were the purists from the family of Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, they're mostly attracting like the rural poor, farmers who were displaced from their lands, and laborers who had been unemployed, etc. They conquer Masada fairly early in the revolt. They conquered from the Romans. It has a tremendous armory because there's a palace. It was a Herodian palace at Masada, with a huge stock of non-perishable food, right, and also a huge stock of weapons, including siege weapons. So now the Sicarii have a tremendous arsenal at their disposal. When the revolt breaks out in Jerusalem, you have this the Sicarii actually come and join. But by the time it's successful and the Romans are driven away, and there's the battle at Bet Horon, where the Zealots are able to take a lot of the weapons and treasure of the Romans that we defeated. By that time, the Sicarii are no longer part of this because of fighting between the Zealots and the Sicarii, right? Where Menaḥem, who was probably the leader who maybe could have, in hindsight, could have really led us to victory had we all just got behind him. He was the leader of the Sicarii. He was killed when ascending Har HaBayit in purple robes, basically declaring himself Melech. He was killed by Elazar ben Ḥananya, who was the son of the Kohen Gadol, whose father had been complicit with the Romans and whose father had been killed by Menaḥem, who had been killed by the Sicarii. Right? So it's complicated because you have, it's actually a very interesting story that Elazar ben Ḥananya, who was, again, he's a wealthy kid, his father was a Kohen Gadol, he himself became the captain of the temple guards. He was kidnapped at one point by the Sicarii years earlier, and he had absorbed many of their ideas. He doesn't become Sicarii, but he essentially adopts the Zealot philosophy. And he's one of the people who launches the revolt against the Romans. What he basically did was he puts a stop to the korbanot on behalf of the emperor. Right? That is essentially a declaration of war. It wasn't the only thing that happened, but it was one of the things that happened, that he puts a stop to the korbanot, the sacrifices, the offerings on behalf of the emperor. And his father was, high priest and owed his position to the Romans, was killed by the Sicarii when they show up to partner with the Zealot organization in the revolt. And this creates obviously animosity between them. When Menaḥem declares himself Melech, king of the Jews, by ascending the Temple Mount in purple robes, he's attacked by the Zealots, led by Elazar ben Ḥananya at this time, and killed. And then his nephew or cousin Elazar ben Yair brings the surviving Sicarii members to Masada, where they basically wait out the war. Now, so it's just basically the Zealot organization under the leadership of Elazar ben Shimon is the Zealot faction in Jerusalem at the time of the victory and the time when this military government is set up. But the military government is, for the most part, not led by the Zealots. So you don't have Sicarii leadership or Zealot leadership. Really, you have basically a kind of moderate leadership that wants to fight or pressure the Romans to have better policies towards us. Whereas the Zealots are not interested in fighting the oppressive Roman regime to make them improve. The Zealots are interested in fighting the foreign regime so that they don't exist here, right? So that we can govern ourselves, so that we can be free in our land. So you have some Zealot representation in this government that's formed, this military junta that's formed, but they're not the dominant voices in this new government. And this new government appoints commanders and sends them to different parts of the country, and Josephus is one of these commanders. Ultimately, he will kind of betray his men and surrender himself to the Romans and be with them for the rest of the war, and essentially become the historian of the Flavian dynasty, right? Emperor, that's why we call him Josephus Flavius. Right? Even though in Hebrew it's Yosef ben Menaḥem HaKohen, he's Josephus Flavius. The Flavius comes from the Flavian dynasty, right? So had the Zealots taken command of this government, it could have been a very different war. There would have been different people in charge. Josephus himself, by the way, even before he betrays his men and surrenders to the Romans, he has a lot of conflict with Yoḥanan ben Levi, who's basically from Gush Chalav. He's the leader, or one of the main leaders of the Zealot movement in the north. He himself had become wealthy by selling Israeli oil, to diaspora Jews.
I was selling back then also.
And so he's a wealthy, wealthy Jew in the north, who basically at first is okay with the Romans, but ultimately comes to a certain realization that we're going to have to fight them and we can't allow them to be in our land. This brings him into conflict with Josephus. He suspects already that Josephus is going to betray the revolution. And when Josephus does that and the north falls, Yoḥanan ben Levi, with many followers, comes down to Jerusalem. And then in Jerusalem, there is a complicated relationship between Yoḥanan and his men and Elazar ben Shimon. For a certain time period, they merge, and Yoḥanan is recognized as the leader. Yoḥanan ben Levi is basically the leader of the Zealot faction in Jerusalem. Later, they'll split again, right? Elazar ben Shimon will split, and you'll have Shimon bar Giora, who was loosely affiliated with the Sicarii, but unlike Elazar ben Yair and his men, Shimon wanted to return to Jerusalem and liberate the city and lead the revolt against the Romans. So you end up having basically three main Zealot movement factions in the city of Jerusalem who are fighting each other. Right? You have Shimon bar Giora leading what we can call a Sicarii faction. You have Elazar ben Shimon, who is a Kohen and the leader of the Jerusalem Zealots, the organization that calls itself the Zealots, who are mostly Kohanim from the lower city. And then you have Yoḥanan ben Levi from Gush Chalav from the north, leading the northern Zealots, right, and those who join them. And you have these three different groups in Jerusalem, plus you have Edomim, you have Edomians, which are people, the descendants of Edom, who were conquered by Yoḥanan Hyrcanus, the son of Shimon ben Mattiyahu. They were enslaved and set free, which means they were forcibly turned into Jews. So you have this whole Edomite population in the country who had become Jews, who still are a little bit separate from us, but are us. Herod was one of them. That's where Herod comes from. The Herodian dynasty came from these guys. And they're also in the city, and they also, even though they have clashes with some of the different Zealot groups, they also are committed to the war against Rome. So basically you have four groups in the city of Jerusalem at that time, who are to a certain extent committed to fighting Rome, but are also fighting each other. And this is a problem. I think this is one of the reasons why we remember the Zealots in a negative way. One of the reasons is just because the rabbis and Josephus had an interest in protecting the Jewish people from Roman wrath and wanting to convince the Romans that no, it wasn't the Jewish people. It was this tiny minority of extremists that created the problem. Right? But also, it's true that the behavior, again, there are mistakes made, and every revolution has mistakes, right? Where the revolutionaries meant to learn from the mistakes of the past, not say the cause is wrong, right? You can't adopt the position that the cause is wrong, the struggle is wrong. The struggle is correct. The struggle of the Zealots is correct. I think both the national struggle and their class struggle is correct. But because they failed, because they made mistakes, I think they were kind of just totally delegitimized in Jewish history, largely because they lost, meaning had they won, they wouldn't have been delegitimized. Like the Maccabim are still upheld as heroes because they won. They were essentially fighting the same struggle. But the Zealots, because they lost, we think of them as the bad guys. And this, I think, was also connected to the machloket between the Haredi world and the Zionists, because it was easy to kind of contextualize the Zealots as like Zionists. And many of the Zionists actually adopted the Zealots and like kind of tried to like revive them in our consciousness, which I think is a good thing. But that was something that the Zionists were doing, not just the revisionists, also the labor Zionists. Also, that was something like these unearthing these parts of our past. So the Haredim kind of basically used their contemporary attitude towards the Zionist movement and applied that anachronistically to the Zealot movement, roughly 2,000 years earlier. But the Zealots were in many ways deeply committed to the Torah. In fact, many of them came from Beit Shammai. Right? They were not, some might have been Beit Hillel, but many were Beit Shammai, and they believed very deeply that they were fighting a holy war. That they were fighting a war to liberate our land from foreign rule, because that is what the Torah demands of us. Okay, so ultimately they were vilified in history. We need to learn from their mistakes. Burning the food, the infighting, right? The sinat chinam, the fact that they fought each other instead of preparing, a united struggle against the Romans, I think is a problem. We need to learn from that. We need to correct that in future situations where we might be in a similar position. But we shouldn't allow that to delegitimize their struggle, their cause, or even their heroism. We should remember and uphold the leaders and the fighters of the Zealot movement, all the different factions, as heroes of our people's story, and we should give them the credit that they're due.